one told you life was gonna be this way? Your job's a joke, you broke, your love life's the old way. It's like you're always stuck in second gear. When it hasn't been your day, or maybe your month, or maybe your year. But I'll be there for you.
Orale way! Welcome back to Mr. D's class. Alright, so we have about 3 more lectures left in this whole Mexican Revolution understanding, and this last 3 series is called The Social Changes That Happened After the Revolution. But to begin, we've got to really understand Cardenismo. This is all the stuff that Lázaro Cárdenas did. And that's the guy we talked about last time, so let's review last class real quick. We talked about the finale for Plutarco Calles and how he controlled the presidencies of Emilio and Ortiz and Abelardo, and basically everybody was sick and tired of him being this puppet behind the scenes using his PNR for devious purposes. The man who finally challenged him was Lázaro Cárdenas. Now, Lázaro Cárdenas won the election in 1934, and as soon as he won, he toured around the country and he won the support of the people. He met them, he gave beautiful speeches, he got to know the populace. And eventually, even though they were from the same party, remember both Calles and Cardenas were both members of the PNR. Eventually, their disagreements went public when there was an issue between labor and management. Calles was supporting management, Cardenas was supporting the strikers, labor, people that were fighting for the right for a better wage. And as soon as this went public, he just purged the entire party of everybody who supported Calles, had every general and congressperson pledge fealty to him. Are you with me or not? Because if you're not with me, get the hell out of here. That's what Cardenas said. And basically, by winning the hearts and minds of the common Mexican, people chose him over Calles' rule. So, to save his life, Calles left to America, to Los Angeles specifically, with Crom's leader Morones. So, let's further analyze what we're going to call Cardenismo, the era in which Cardenas was president. He did a lot of important stuff, more than most of his predecessors. Let's begin with land reform. So, let's pause so you can copy this real quick. Alright, so, just to keep things in mind, alright, during Cardenas' presidency, the gross domestic product of Mexico grew 25%. In about 5 years, it was that average rate of growth, 25% every single year. That's huge. And production rose about 50%. People were excited to be under this leader, this person who was one of them for once, not some bureaucrat, some elitist. And instead of keeping a balanced budget, he used the government's newfound money and taxes to improve education, to improve labor and land infrastructure, that people had more rights so they could enjoy going to work, so they could get machinery. Well, let's focus first on land reform. He spent a lot of money here. First of all, he gave more land than all of his predecessors combined. He gave 45 million acres of land to the poor. And to get them to begin to work together, he formed what are called ejidos. This was commonly owned land, a very socialist idea, in which people would reap the profits and split the profits of what they made when they used the land. And this was way better than the hacendados. If you remember the haciendas, these were the huge landowners that basically made money off of the poor people that knew no better. So in creating these ejidos, he raised the standard of living for your average peasant. He was able to feed his own country. Land was arable. People were excited because they had a stake in planting and growing their own things and selling their own things so they could get themselves out of poverty. In an effort to stop any potential old owners from going back and trying to get back their old territory, he encouraged self-defense units so that peasants could be ready to fight against old owners that had a lot of money and could pay for soldiers to attack their new ejidos. He set up agricultural banks so that they didn't have to worry about rich bankers, scoffing and not supporting these farmers. And he gave a lot of money for farming machinery so that the farmers could plant more efficiently and even better farming practices. So this is truly a man of the people. And here you can see the GDP rising under Cardenas. 25% per year for 5 years. It's pretty huge, okay? Really improved the economy. And it would be that way under the PRA for a very long time, up until 2000. Here we can see him redistributing land to the people. Cardenismo, a super popular ideology that the Mexicans just completely bought up, and they loved him for it. Here he is with the common man wearing a sombrero. He changed the name of the PNR eventually to the PRI. And remember, under him there was more education, more money, more machinery, more banks, all for the farmer. So the farmer was truly happy. Now, first things he fixed was farming practices. Let's talk now about the workers, labor. Let's pause. All right, so Cardenas basically had to get everybody who was against CROM. If you remember, CROM was that huge, bloated union organization that created under Morones, who had just fled the country, who had lost sight of who empowered them, and basically was constantly siding with management instead of helping out the workers and supporting higher wages for those that needed the most. Unions are supposed to support the worker, the common man, not the people that are in charge. So Cardenas set up the Confederation of Mexican Workers, the Confederación de Trabajadores Mexicanos, under a socialist, a guy named Vicente Lombardo, and he was able to get 1 million members to join. Strikes were encouraged and increased in all parts of the economy. Remember that Cardenas liked strikers. He wanted people to go on strike. He wanted people to fight for their right to have or belong to Mexico. And it culminated in two huge strikes. The first of which was the railway strike of 1936. And eventually, it got so heated that Cardenas decided to nationalize the railway system. It would now belong purely to Mexico. It would not belong to America, who would have created it. They are the ones that created the system and were profiting from the shipping. Now, there was no international backlash when they nationalized it because, fortunately or unfortunately for the Mexicans, it didn't make a lot of money. It actually cost a lot of money to run these railways. So, but it was good that he did it because it gave him the confidence to be able to potentially, and he will, nationalize more important things in the future. All right? Now remember, Cardenas supports strikes because he knew that when they finally compromised, when management and labor compromised, more often than not, the compromises benefited the average Mexican laborer, the common man, of which 90% was the laborer. So here we can see Vicente Lombardo getting the CTM together, over 1 million people. A very Marxist, very socialist group. Here we can see Vicente and Cardenas working together. These are two heroes of the post-Mexican Revolution era under their banner, the CTM, the Workers of Mexico. Here you can see La Huelga, that means the strike. Up, go on the strike. People went on strike. And remember, united we are one. United we can fight these oppressors. And that's the important thing right here, okay? The railway strike was the first of two that are very important strikes, and it ended up having them nationalize the railway. Pretty big deal, all right? It was a huge win for Cardenas and the Mexican people. Now, let's talk about the oil nationalization, and I'll introduce the idea here because this is a huge deal. In fact, even today, there is a national holiday for the day that they nationalized the oil industry and created the huge company Pemex. So let's watch.
Mexico in the modern era. Even after the revolution, millions of its people remained poor. While Mexico itself was a land of rich natural resources, its abundance had never been used to benefit the majority of the people. The 1920s and 30s saw the further development of one of the world's greatest deposits of oil along Mexico's coastal region. American and European petroleum companies poured in large sums of money developing refineries and oil fields. Mexican crude flowed to international markets, but this time Mexico's government learned from the past and took steps to keep history from repeating itself. Since the age of Cortés, foreigners had looted Mexico of her riches. The Spaniards plundered the land throughout the colonial era. In the 19th century, America stole half of Mexico's territory. And in the 20th century, U.S. robber barons exploited Mexico's resources to fuel the fires of American industry. In 1938, the PRI, the dominant political force of 20th century Mexico, determined that this time things would be different. The wealth flowing from Mexico's oil fields would flow into Mexican.
Pretty huge, huh? There's going to be a second video on the oil industry because it's that big of a deal. Let me pause so you can write down this pretty big slide. I'm sorry in advance. All right, so The oil industry, and this goes hand in hand with the era. It's 1937. World War II has just begun. FDR is much more focused on Hitler and on Hirohito in Japan than he really would care to think about Cardenas in the South. But there was a huge benefit to Cardenas. The oil industry was in enormous demand. They were making tons of money because of World War II. But unfortunately, for the Mexican worker, they were not seeing these huge profits in their wages. So, as they had done with the railway strike, they went on strike. And this was a huge risk. I mean, Mexico, this is their biggest export. This is where they get the majority of their GDP. It's from oil. But because the entire industry was owned by America and by Britain, it had this huge sense of national pride. People were they really wanted to go and get back what was rightfully theirs when they were too foolish to see the bigger picture of how the world worked, and they had just given it away for infrastructure projects. So Cardenas acted. And he did so in a very legal way. So the workers were demanding a wage increase, and he, using experts, found that the total wage increase would cost these companies around 26 million pesos. So Cardenas formed a commission, an independent commission, to see if these companies could afford this, this pretty big cost to help these workers be happy. The commission found that they could definitely take this hit, that they were making tons of money and they could afford to pay the strikers. So Cardenas backed the strikers. The company, as you can imagine, they refused. They would not pay what the workers wanted, to not set a precedent, you could argue. Then the Supreme Court got involved, and it too sided with the workers. So you've got not just the executive branch, but the judicial branch siding with the workers. But the company still refused, and they should know what was coming. Cardenas had no choice. He nationalized the oil companies. He paid them $130 million, and he created the largest state-run oil company in all of the Americas, Pemex, Petroleum Mexico. And it is the second largest company today after Brazil's huge petroleum company. Now, Cardenas knew something that the people did not. He knew that he could get away with this because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, the American president who was fighting in World War II, could not afford to lose Mexico as an ally since she had so much oil, and it would be even worse if there was any kind of inclination of Japan or Germany gaining any kind of influence in Mexico. That would be the worst. So, in exchange for Mexico's support in the war, they were allowed to nationalize their huge oil industry without much of a backlash. So here we can see that photo of the Mexican flag and Cardenas taking the oil fields that belonged to him. Here we can see Pemex, one of the largest companies in the world today, and it is still proudly owned today, although it is up for debate. You can see right here it says Pemex no se vende. That means don't sell Pemex. People are considering breaking it up and selling it off. That is the current president today of the PRI, Peña Nieto, I think his name, the current president today. So one last video on oil being nationalized before we finish for today.
Cardenas aggressively pursues agrarian reform. He structures the process so that both the peasantry and the country as a whole will prosper. 50 million acres of land are returned to the peasants. Labor reforms are initiated that improve conditions in the mines and factories and give the workers power they never had. Next, Cardenas turns his attention to the issue of oil.
The petroleum workers come together and they form a powerful national industrial union. They put forward a demand for a new ambitious labour contract which the private companies absolutely refuse to take seriously. They claim they can't afford to meet any of the demands of the petroleum workers.
Well, if we do that, we might just as well go out of business.
Most American and British oil company executives assume that a compromise deal will be reached between the foreign oil companies and the Mexican government.
But they fundamentally miscalculate. They miscalculate the determination of President Cardenas, and a decision is made to expropriate the oil industry, which really sets the cat amongst the pigeons.
The oil companies thought that he would not dare to do so for several reasons. The United States would probably take strong reprisals against Mexico. After all, nationalizing oil, the strategic resource, was a tremendous challenge to the United States. Secondly, it was a precedent for the rest of Latin America.
Es decir, tenía una visión, una integridad personal, una valentía, porque cuando se enfrenta a Estados Unidos no sabe muy bien qué va a pasar.
La expropiación petrolera no es simplemente de justicia, es de soberanía nacional.
Because the oil companies refused to accept Cardenas' terms, the Mexican government takes over ownership of the oil fields and pays off the oil companies. In the wake of the Great Depression, Cardenas has saddled Mexico with more debt, but the Mexicans don't seem to mind and pitch in to help the government.
The news of the oil expropriation was greeted with jubilation by quite a large body of people. And in villages and in towns and in Mexico City, workers and citizens wanting to demonstrate their commitment and support to the government by ransacking the jewel boxes and ransacking the treasures to bring jewelry for donation to the state. It demonstrates how strongly the themes of economic nationalism and political pride had become by the late 1930s.
So there's an exam next class. This is a tough one, but the good news is that you really should only focus on Calles and Cardenas, all right? Everything before, I mean, you can loosely cover about Calles' little puppet presidents, but you don't have to know all those names. Remember that it'll be just an outline that I'm asking for. You'll have about 30 minutes to do it. The question is compare and contrast both the politics and the legacy of Calles and Cardenas. So they both have quite a legacy. One is a bit more positive than the other. Remember that you need to have a thesis. I want your paragraph headers to refer to those thesis points that you bring up. Show me you understand the material by putting as many facts as possible to get those points. You're going to use those earplugs if I'm giving a lecture, and remember, don't worry about the conclusion. Be sure to study. This stuff is pretty complicated at this point. But hopefully you'll be ready and prepared. So good luck studying, and